Hello and welcome to Talking Books. I'm Jill de Villiers. What is it that differentiates highly successful people from those who lead perfectly run-of-the-mill mundane lives? My guest today broke out from the restrictions of normality to shape his own world. By the age of 25, he ran a 400 million rand division of a multinational firm. Now, not yet 35 years old, he is the CEO of a boutique investment firm, one of the youngest directors of a JSE-listed company, and a sought-after public speaker on the international stage. He is also widely known as a judge on Dragon's Den. He is Vusi Thembekwayo, and he's here to talk about his latest book, Vusi, Business and Life Lessons from a Black Dragon. Vusi, thanks very much for coming in.
How do you do, Jill?
Chatting. It's very nice to have you here.
Thank you.
Now, your book is not very thick.
Yeah.
But surprisingly, there is a lot of information in it.
Right.
And what also stood out for me about this book is how beautifully it is written.
Thank you. I must tell you that I work quite deliberately to make the book the size it is. I write the way I read. So I battle to read large, copious amounts of books, thick books. I thought, make it thin enough that it's consumable. But of course, as you say, enjoy the actual reading experience. Yeah.
So one of the things that you talk about is the change after the apartheid, the new world in South Africa.
Yeah.
But that people aren't necessarily free yet in their mindset.
Yeah.
And you use two great examples in the book. One of the chicken. And then one of the dog. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So the chicken story. My grandmother used to keep chickens. And one day the fence had come undone and the chicken was running out, and she asked me to tie the chicken to a tree, and I did do for the day. And then later on in the day, my uncles had fixed the fence and she said, go and untie the chicken. So I went and untied the chicken, and the chicken that had been running freely for weeks before then was simply constrained for a day. After I'd undone it, didn't recognize that it had been freed. And so it stayed in the same spot, and I almost had to shoo it to go, you're free now. And I think that's a great analogy for where most of us find ourselves. We come from spaces of being constricted to a particular place and being kept to a way of thinking. And we've been molded into how we relate with the world. And all of a sudden you're told you're free. But we have no reference for what freedom is. So we act freed rather than free. We show and we find symbols to show that we are free, whereas actual true freedom is people who don't feel the need to express it, they just are.
So, but how then can you achieve that? How can you break away from that feeling of just being freed and to become actually free?
So one of the things I try to do with the book is to raise a level of awareness, because I think it's very hard to change something you're not aware of. And I think many of us, and I speak for myself included, until it came upon me that I was behaving in a freed way. In South Africa, for instance, we have an assetless middle class. The assetless middle class is precisely because we have people who want to behave free by showing disposable income, but don't understand that the concept of a middle class is actually based on assets, not earnings. So one of the things you have to do is raise people's level of awareness and go, this is how you're behaving. Now that you know, seek to behave differently. To do it is very difficult, because it does mean you have to live contrarian to what society dictates. And you have to find your own way of living and your own cadence, your own rhythm. And in living according to your own rhythm, you then express true freedom.
But you also have the debt trap that people get into in that middle class. So they think they're free. How do I express it? I express it by my fancy car, my fancy home. And in the meantime, I'm getting deeper and deeper and deeper in
100%, because what we've done, it's a beautifully phrased, right, is what we've done is we've created symbols of freedom. And freedom doesn't need symbols, it just is. You just exist in a space where you're free. And what that means often is not just being freed from what society expects of you, but it's being free from what you feel the need to tell society. It's saying, I don't need to express this to you in this way. Now, it starts off, I suppose, in part about how we're living our lives economically. It has huge implications for how we live our lives socially. It has huge implications for where we live, where we buy homes. It has huge implications for what languages we speak and the schools we send our children to. It has huge implications for how we relate in our social spaces, men and women. Because if I am a man and I am to be seen to be free, then there is a specific way I must behave, very alpha, very domineering. If I'm a woman and I'm seen to be free, then I must be almost aggressive to the male. And what you find is that freedom are people who don't buy either. They just live with peace in themselves. It is a deeply, deeply difficult state to find.
So it's an attitude change. Now, what I'm just trying to think what you called it. It's an attitude, something club.
An
attitude adjustment club. That people need that.
That's it, yeah. Yeah, so AAK is what my mother used to call it. Every single time we did something she did not approve. She said the back of her hand had the initials AAK inscribed on them, which meant an attitude adjustment club.
But how do you get an attitude adjustment club? By suffering a lot in life? Is that the only way you can get that attitude adjustment club?
Yeah, I think there are different ways. I think the more spoken about is the way of suffering. But the other one is the way of being inspired. So in the book, I open with a chapter of The Running Man. And the idea that as a black man, I felt for most parts of my life that I was running away from something. I was always running away from captivity. I was running away from poverty. I was running away from the township. I was running away from poverty and from where I come from, rather than running towards something, which is I'm inspired by what is possible. And when you run towards something, it's a lot more uplifting, because it means that there is a goal that you're chasing rather than a nemesis that you fear. It also means that you embrace where you come from. You don't see it as something that is less than. You're proud of your roots and your heritage. You see your roots and your heritage as a part of who you are, rather than a part of who you're trying to become.
You use Usain Bolt as your running man.
Yes.
And you talk about his coming from Africa, his roots in Africa,
Right.
moving to Jamaica,
Right.
and the genetic line that
Right.
was built there and strengthened there.
Right.
And it also tells you about the genetic line that is still on the continent,
Right.
and what people should be proud of.
100%. So the Caribbean islands, for me, are a fascinating study, because if you look at particularly the sprint events in the Olympics, 4, 2, and the 100 meters, respectively, you'll find that the Caribbean athletes have done much better than the Americans. Yet the Caribbeans, Jamaica specifically, is 2 million people. And it's quite a poor country. In fact, it's very poor, right? The Americans are 300 million people, and it's the wealthiest nation on earth. So how is it that a country with a much smaller population group and much higher levels of poverty can outcompete the wealthiest, most industrious nation on earth? It is because there is an inbuilt genetic advantage. Where the slaves were taken from West Africa, men and women there are built in a specific way, and it's a part of the diet and as well as the environment and the climate. You then had a period of slavery, 400 years. And what happened when you took slaves was it was the strongest that made it to the other end. So there was a process there of getting to the strongest men and women. Then when they got to the Caribbeans, you turned them into slaves, which physically made them even stronger. So today, when you're trying to compete with a Caribbean athlete, you're competing with a person who has centuries of genetic advantage inbuilt, and it's very difficult. And I think the point I make in the book is, rather than look at where we come from as a source of disadvantage, we should actually try to look at it as a source of advantage, that we know what poverty is, therefore we have nothing to lose. So one of the things we should have done when the great promise of 94 came is I think we should have thought differently about our economics. We should have thought differently about how do we build businesses that are socially conscious? How do we build leaders that are connected to their communities? Because we had nothing to lose. But what we did do instead is we perpetuated the way things were done. And now we're all invested in the system. And it's much harder to try and deconstruct it and build something better.
So you talk quite a lot about BEE,
Yeah.
and you're not 100% behind the concept of BEE.
Yeah. The reason is very simple. There are parts of the legislation that I think are not only necessary, but must be done. And we can't be apologetic about it. And these include, in my mind, enterprise development, supply development, skills development, and more specifically, what I was a beneficiary of, employment equity. The idea that you take black talent in organizations, accelerate it and give it exposure, particularly to P&L functions, so it knows how to run businesses. What I am not now, and not have ever been a supporter of, is the idea of a share-based transaction BEE. Because what we did is we took organizations that were lily white, we gave access to 1 or 2, 3 wealthy, very connected business people, banks leveraged money, allowed these people to buy shares into these organizations that were not operationally involved in, and we said we're now empowered. It did many things, but one of the great distortions was it meant that for small black businesses coming up, they couldn't compete on the color of their business. You can't compete on the fact that you're black now, because there is a larger company that is white, that is a century old, that has scale advantage, that has massive assets and a balance sheet, that also has the same BE scorecard as you. So you can be a black entrepreneur, but you can't succeed. It seems to me we became enemies of our own progress. The Afrikaners, just a final note, the Afrikaners for me are a great model of how you do this. And what the Afrikaners did just after 1948 when the Nats took power is they came to a specific deliberate decision that they would not buy into any British businesses. So rather than buying into Standard Bank, they created Volkskas, which became ABSA. Rather than buying into Old Mutual and Federal, they created Santam and Sanlam. And I think we had an opportunity to do the same. We should have started from scratch and built businesses that we could turn around in 20 and 30 years and go, these are businesses of the new South Africa. And I think we lost that opportunity.
Now, as a venture capitalist,
Yes, ma'am.
you are behind supporting young black entrepreneurs.
Yes, ma'am.
What are your criteria for helping them?
So there are several. We think of ourselves as a fund that is predominantly but not exclusively black. We love to support black talent. But 15 years in business has taught me that business has no race. At the end of the month when you go to pay payroll, your staff don't go, are you black or white, and are you going to pay me or not? When you go to pay rentals, your landlord doesn't care what complexion you are. You're either going to pay it or you're not. So I think it's important that we disconnect a bit of the racial complexion conversation to the actual nuance of business. Good business people are good business people. You know this to be true too, because people talk about taxi owners. Taxi owners are phenomenal business people. Just think about the idea of buying an asset, knowing the rate at which you depreciate it, which route you're going to put it on, as well as what cost per kilometer you're going to get on that asset, how many consumers you're going to get, and how do you price per consumer so you make a margin. This is phenomenal business etiquette and thinking. These guys are not poor business people. So what's required for us is to build systems and structures that enable entrepreneurs to succeed. The question you asked is, so what do we look for? We look for a great enterprising individual. And what that means is a person who thinks of themselves as an entrepreneur, right? Not a business person, but a person who's able to do stuff with whatever's there, is the first thing. The second thing we look for is people who have what we call the third eye. And it's something you either have or you don't. When you pull up on Grayston and you see those young people cleaning on your windows, 99% of the population see a nuisance. An entrepreneur will look at somebody and go, where's he buying his squeegee from? And can I service it, right? Where does he drink water? Maybe I could sell him some water or whatever. So there are, entrepreneurs have that third eye, and you either have it or you don't. That's something you're either built with or you're not. And the third is we look for people who failed.
Okay.
Our research shows us actually that if you failed, your chances of success are much higher than a person who's trying it the first time, or even worse, a person who's never failed at all.
You say as well that failure is brutal.
Yeah.
And most people are discouraged by that first brutal failure.
Yeah.
How do you overcome that?
I think it's important to know why you're there. And this is, again, goes back to the conversation about, are you running away from something or are you running towards something? When you know why you're doing what you're doing and you're clear about what you want to achieve, it's much easier to face obstacles. Coincidentally, I fail much more than I succeed. It's, people read your resume. You'd be forgiven for thinking the person is just a walking. I fail, of every 10 battles I take, I lose 6. But the 4 that I win in quantum outmeasure the 6 that I lose. So what it is about failure is recognizing that failure is a part of the process. It's not apart from it. And that quite the contrary, if you don't fail, then you actually are not building a residue of emotion that understands what it takes to build great scalable businesses.
Vusi, I could talk to you for hours, absolutely hours, but we've come to the end of the show, and I just want to thank you very much again for coming in.
I'm humbled. Thank you, Jill.
Thank you. My guest is Vusi Thembekwayo, and his latest book is Vusi, Business and Life Lessons from a Black Dragon. And that was it for this edition of Talking Books. Thanks for watching.